Timothy Goes to School was a fairly well-known cartoon based on a book series for children centered around the day-to-day life of the titular Timothy, a young raccoon inhabiting a world of anthropomorphic animals. The show wasn't anything remarkable and was very much geared for the younger audience, but with such an innocent show, there was bound to be some kind of urban legend or, quote, creepypasta to be found, and I was fortunate enough to catch a glimpse of one such legend. What I witnessed was a story called Timothy's Bad Week, and was provided by YouTube. Like many things on the internet these days, I assumed it was just a fan-made creepypasta or a trolling attempt. Either way, I decided to allow my morbid curiosity to get the better of me, and sat back to watch what horrors some crazy guy on the internet had inserted into one of my cartoon childhood shows. I fully expected a YouTube poop-style run crammed with creepy cliches, and sure enough, the video played in black and white with poor image quality that made the characters seem like they were constantly shifting. Someone had edited the eyes so they were white voids, but I noticed they left the theme tune and opening sequence otherwise untouched. Following the intro, the video cut to black and text read, Monday, before opening to an empty street with Timothy dressed for school, waiting at the bus stop. Animation as bad as ever and all done in black and white with those edited eyes. I rolled my eyes a bit at this. Seemed like everyone who ever wrote a Lost episode had to do something freaky with the eyes. Regardless, I watched as the bus pulled over and Timothy got on. All the characters were on the bus, but seemed a little different. Yoko the cat seemed to be angry. The two Franks, both bulldogs, were fighting each other and no one seemed to bother despite their brawl being quite physical. Next to the fighting Franks sat Doris the beaver, always depicted as a bit of a tomboy. She was much larger than usual, to the point of looking morbidly obese, and kept crying as Flitz the badger and Claudia the raccoon taunted her repeatedly from a nearby seat. Timothy went to sit by a window and glanced over at Nora the mouse, who was holding hands with Charles, another mouse. The pair stared out in front of themselves as if trying to block out the rest of the world. Finally, at the very back of the bus sat Lily the fox, having only one shoe and looking rather upset. One of her arms seemed to have noticeable bruises. The scene suddenly went black and text read, Tuesday. To my surprise, when the text faded, the scene once again showed Timothy waiting for the bus. This time his clothing seemed a little dirty and torn as the bus pulled up and he climbed on board. Yoko the cat seemed even angrier than before. The two Franks were covered in cuts and bruises as they kept looking over at one another from either side of the bus, as if ready to fight again at any moment. Doris was cowering in her seat as Flitz and Claude began to pelt her with spitballs. No one really seemed to notice or care. Timothy once again sat by the window and glanced over at Nora and Charles. The two mice are now huddled together as if frightened, still staring in front of themselves, ears pinned back. At the very back of the bus, Lily was now completely barefoot and her bruised arm was now visibly scarred, a small cut also visible on her right ear. The scene once again went black and read, Wednesday. By this point, I was getting a bit bored by the repetitive cuts, yet my curiosity demanded I continue to view regardless, as the scene once again showed Timothy waiting for the bus. This time his clothing was very dirty and torn. His fur also began to look unkempt as the bus pulled up and he climbed on board. Yoko is now flexing her claws, quite literally, and scratching the back of the seat in front of her in anger. The two Franks were still covered in cuts and bruises, though one of them now sported a cast on their arm as the other glared with a look of pure hate at the other sibling. Doris was sobbing and begging Fritz and Claude to leave her alone as they taunted her, tossing donuts at her and that they had smuggled onto the bus and that they had smuggled onto the bus in a small box. Timothy, per usual, sat by a window and glanced over at Nora and Charles. Only this time Nora was by herself, looking very unwell as she continuously looked at the empty space Charles had been only a day earlier. At the very back of the bus, Lily was still barefoot, her feet now covered in mud and her fur unkempt as her dress was all torn, her scarred arm now laying limp as one of her ears now had a large chunk missing. The screen went black once more and the text read, Thursday. I have to admit, at this point I was a little unnerved. Whoever had made this YouTube prank sure had a lot of time to waste. Then again, I guess I was no better as I continued to watch. The text faded to reveal Timothy waiting for the bus yet again. This time his clothing was practically falling off of him, and his fur looked like it was extremely dirty and unkempt. Once again, the bus pulled over and Timothy climbed on in. Yoko was nowhere to be seen. The two Franks were now down to one, who was covered from head to toe in vicious-looking scars and trembled uncontrollably, muttering to himself. Doris was catatonic as Fritz and Claude sat quietly, looking away from her and seeming to lower their heads every now and then in a state of great shame. Timothy, as he always did, sat by a window and glanced over at the empty chair Nora had occupied the other day. When he noticed she was gone, Timothy turned to Fritz and Claude for the first time. The pair once again lowered their heads as if to avoid his stare. At the very back of the bus, Lily was covered from head to toe in mud, cuts, and bruises. Her clothing was shredded and her right ear was now bandaged, and she had taken to rocking back and forth, singing, "Kookaburra sits in the old gum tree." This is when things got very strange, even by Creepypasta standards. The "Kookaburra sits in the old gum tree" song continued to play over and over as the scene turned to black and text read, "Friday." The song played on loop as the now familiar sight of Timothy waiting for the bus appeared. However, he was now on crutches and hobbled onto the bus with a look of anger. The bus was completely empty save for Fritz and Claude, the pair now sitting on either side of the bus and shaking uncontrollably as Timothy stopped and looked at them both before he headed to the usual window. Then everything faded to black as the "Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree" song played one final time before the video cut off. After a moment of thought, I turned off my computer and went back to do some work in the real world, deciding that while it was an interesting watch, this video was far from the best. Nevertheless, I saved the link so that I could show a friend of mine who used to watch the show religiously just to mess with them. It took a couple of days before I managed to get said friend around, and I opened the link to show them the story. But to my surprise, the link ended up showing a normal episode of Timothy Goes to School. Then my friend had a good laugh at my expense as I desperately tried to convince them I wasn't crazy. To this day, I have yet to fully understand where the real link went, and part of me truly wonders if I didn't dream it all up. Whatever the case of the story of Timothy's bad week soon went from a pasta I'd hoped to forget about a cheap joke on a friend into a years-long obsession. Maybe someday somebody will find it again. Until then, happy hunting, I guess. Okay, so this was something new. I have read this pasta in the past, but going out and giving the story another go really helped cement everything that was going on in this pasta in my mind. Not only that, but the fact that this lost episode actually had a relatively good plotline instead of gore and blood shooting all over the place was a really nice touch with this story. With that said though, this pasta wasn't entirely perfect, as there were some moments in the story that really could have either been excluded or replaced with something else in mind, at least to me personally. And that's what we're about to go on ahead and get ourselves into. For a lost episode story, I have to admit that the main character in this pasta was actually pretty much really well written. Not 100% amazing, but pretty good nonetheless. What I really liked the most about this protagonist was the fact that the reactions that they had were very realistic and didn't automatically go into the typical, "I was so scared," or, quote, "I will never watch X show again, XD." The protagonist manages to act in a manner that any average person would normally react in seeing something like this. Slightly bored at the startup of the video, a little bit annoyed by the excessive repetitiveness, and then unnerved, not terrified, but unnerved at the more darker elements that this episode played, all the way up until around the very end. What I also have to commend as well with the way the protagonist was written was the fact that this individual didn't go out and destroy their computer or do any kind of level of dumb shit like that, but more or less only was slightly unnerved by the whole thing before immediately brushing the feeling off and wanting to go off and sit there and show that to a friend of theirs to kind of screw with them. I will admit, however, that The one problem I did have with the protagonist was the consistent mentioning of various creepypasta tropes and the like. Personally, for me, I felt that it was rather unneeded, especially with how frequently the protagonist mentions it as the episode goes on. Another slight issue that I did have was the protagonist consistently interrupting the parts of the actual episode with, one good example of this, let me actually just sit there and click on this real quickly. Let me see. Okay, for example, the text read Tuesday. To my surprise, when the text faded, the scene, not that. Okay, here we go. This is a better option. Wednesday. By this point, I was getting a little bored at the repetitive cuts, yet my curiosity demanded I continue to view regardless of the scene showed once again Timothy waiting for the bus. That right there, in my honest opinion, could have been potentially left out, or at the very least, put out at the end. But overall, though, despite that issue, well, if you even really want to call it an issue, it wasn't really that much of a problem. And I'll admit that, again, the protagonist was a very solid character, and in my opinion, I believe many writers, before they even consider making a Lost episode, should go out and read the story and take a little bit of inspiration when it comes to writing a protagonist that isn't a complete weakling, scared constantly, or things like that, in order to sit there and be able to properly craft a realistic protagonist that I think most Lost episode creepypastas really tend to lack. The actual Lost episode that was described in the story, despite the cliches of everything being black and white and the character's eyes being a bright white, was also very well detailed and had a really great storyline with it, which unfortunately is extremely rare for Lost episode creepypastas to have, given how most stories around that genre pretty much go into the quote guts and gore elements of the story almost immediately and don't provide any level of character development, or at the very least a proper build up to the actual plotline itself. Again, very rarely actually having a rhyme of reason or reason for anything really happening in most pastas. This story actually manages to break the mold by telling a dark story behind the show Timothy Goes to School, with the characters all gradually over time going through some problems, either suffering through something or inflicting pain and things like that through various issues that all seem to affect them in one way or another, again, relatively gradually. Which in my opinion really helped keep my focus on the story and actually had me wanting more with the progression of the episode as it went on. I genuinely was interested in how this was going to end. Now again, I've never really watched the show before, but despite me not knowing much about the series, I could still kind of piece together everything that was going on and see the pasta for what it truly was and the potential, contrast and everything that did actually perhaps go on in the original series. Overall, the episode was very spot on, and actually had me wanting to watch the series for myself and see the contrast of the show and the things that this pasta had, to kind of see whether or not if the pasta itself is a little bit more realistic, or if it's just kind of more of an excessive fabrication. Now we get into the part of the review where I go into details about what I didn't exactly find to be too great about the pasta, whether it be some elements of the story or cliches or things like that. This is technically the part where I go and point them out. And I will admit, while there were a few elemental issues that the story itself had, I do think that the story in question was still pretty solid. However, these things do need to be pointed out in order to make sure that actions like these are not done again. My first issue that I have with the story, like I mentioned in the review, was a consistent mentioning of creepypastas and various Lost episode tropes throughout the story. I honestly don't have too much of a problem with the protagonist being slightly self-aware in their story, but the amount of times that I've seen the word creepypasta mentioned in the pasta kinda took me away from the story just a bit. When it comes to making a Lost episode creepypasta, you always want to have it basically centered down, for the most part, on someone going out and basically telling their story in a realistic manner. You want to have the protagonist give their accounts and make it believable enough for readers to question whether or not this actually could very well likely be a legitimate episode or not. That right there is, in my opinion, a main key when it comes to really making a good lost episode story. And again, consistently mentioning creepypastas alike really kind of takes away from the story. It takes away from it, and it only sits there and gives you this thing that, oh, you're just reading a story. You're not actually going out there and reading what's supposed to be an account of what a person went through, which is a bit of a problem in this story, and kind of the main problem that I have with the pasta. Another issue that I do have with the story, well, rather minor, was the inclusion of the backgrounds being black and white and the eyes being a glowing white. Kind of two sets of cliches that were there. However, I am willing to go out of my way and forgive that, given the fact that it's not mentioned very often in the pasta. It is mentioned here and there, but it manages to keep the cliches down to a very minimum and focuses more on the storyline rather than the oddities, well, the cliche oddities, I might add, within the story, which I really felt was a wonderful thing with this pasta. But again, I still felt that these two inclusions were a little bit unnecessary to include. Had this been a little bit more, say, distorted in the characters, kind of more or less just looking a little bit more, I don't really know, maybe not, maybe slightly unnerved, would have been a little bit better in my opinion. But then again, it's just a very minor issue and doesn't take away from the story that much. Overall, my final thoughts on this pasta are as follows. This creepypasta was actually really good for what it was. I loved the story, I loved the episode's plotline, and the fact that it was pretty much realistic through and through was another thing with the story that I really liked. While the cliches that were included were a little bit silly and rather repetitive at times, they didn't exactly take away from the pasta's enjoyability, which, for me, is amazing. And it's unfortunate, too, that most writers don't actually go out of their way when it comes to making lost episode stories. They don't really go out and they don't really try and make their story their own. They just sit there and consistently repeat the same cliches over and over and over again, hence the reason why they are cliches, and don't really provide much of a good level of a storyline. And that's really disappointing because other than Pearl.avi and a couple of classical lost episode stories, most other creepypastas don't really go into that kind of direction. They don't really tell a story. Instead, they just rely on the character is sad for whatever reason and then does X or X or X, cliches like killing everybody, dying, or ending their life, or whatever it might seem to be because a specific action happened. I mean, a good example of this would probably be 95% of the stories on Geoshia or Spinpasta or even the Creepypasta wiki relating to lost episode pastas, or things like that, or the characters sitting there and doing things completely out of the ordinary, the protagonist sitting there and acting like a complete idiot, which is again another major problem with most lost episode stories, but still. The pasta really did everything that it could to break away from that habit and come up with something of its own, which is, again, a thing I honestly believe should be 100% commended, and is very commendable, especially to the author of the story who made this. Which is why I am going to give this story a 9.5 out of 10 on the Creepypasta scale. Now, why exactly is it not 10 out of 10? Well, the main reason being why it's not getting that extra 0.5, which is a small number, but still, is because of the creepypasta thing being mentioned a lot and the couple of cliches that were thrown in. But overall, an amazing creepypasta, very well done, very well detailed. I loved it a lot. It was just a very enjoyable story through and through. But what did you guys think about this creepypasta? Did you guys enjoy it? Did you guys not? And also, what would you have personally done to help make the story a lot better? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. I'd really like to hear your own personal thoughts. Thanks again for watching today's Creepypasta, you guys, and if you happen to be brand new here to this channel and you like what you see, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. I make brand new videos every single week, specifically usually 2, and it would be amazing if you could go and support my channel through any means necessary. And if you don't happen to like what I make or whatever, or if this is the only thing that you want to watch, then that's perfectly fine too. But yeah, we're all entitled to our own opinions relating to creepypastas, and again, like I always say, this is only my opinion. I'd like to hear your own personal thoughts. Thanks again for watching today's episode, you guys. I'll be seeing you all in the next video, and like always, roll the outro, because I'm out. In fear and surprise, as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to thee, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horde-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any day.